The small town of Dunswich lay at the edge of the countryside, where narrow dirt roads twisted like veins through endless fields and crumbling stone walls. Beyond the town's last row of sagging houses stood Blackwood Hill, crowned by a mansion long abandoned and whispered about for generations. The townsfolk called it Hollow's End, though few dared speak the name after dark. Its towering silhouette dominated the horizon, even under daylight, its broken spires clawing against the sky like skeletal fingers. Children dared each other to run up the hill, but no one stayed long enough to reach the iron gates. The mansion's reputation was one of silence and decay, but the silence always seemed to be listening. For Jonathan Hale, however, the house was not a nightmare. It was an opportunity. An aspiring writer of dark thrillers, he had inherited Hollow's End from a distant uncle he'd never met. The will had arrived without warning, its parchment smelling faintly of mildew, signed by a solicitor who offered no explanation other than, "You are the last of his bloodline." The words unsettled Jonathan, though his curiosity overshadowed any unease. He convinced himself that a stay in the mansion might finally break his creative drought. If nothing else, it would make for the perfect backdrop for his next novel. With that in mind, he loaded his old car with notebooks, clothes, and a camera, and set off for the town that hadn't changed since the 1800s when Jonathan arrived. The locals were quick to notice him. Their stares carried weight, heavy with caution, as though they recognized him without needing an introduction. At the only diner in town, the waitress froze when he mentioned Hollow's End. "You're better off finding a room here," she muttered, pouring coffee with trembling hands. "That house doesn't want anyone in it. It remembers." Her words lingered with an uncanny seriousness, and for a moment Jonathan felt a shiver run up his spine. But he laughed it off, convincing himself she was playing into local superstition. Still, he caught the cook glaring at him from the kitchen door, lips pressed into a thin, grim line, and suddenly the whole diner seemed too quiet. By late afternoon, Jonathan reached Blackwood Hill. The iron gates were rusted but surprisingly intact, their hinges screeching as if alive when he pushed them open. Weeds strangled the cobblestone driveway, and statues with weathered faces stared down from both sides, their expressions eroded into grimaces. The mansion loomed overhead, its windows gaping like hollow sockets. From a distance it seemed dead, but the closer he walked, the more it looked like it was waiting. He paused at the foot of the porch steps, clutching the iron key the solicitor had sent him. The air was heavier here, thick with the smell of damp wood and something metallic, something like blood. The door opened with a reluctant groan, as if protesting his intrusion. Dust swirled in the dim light of the foyer, drifting lazily from the high rafters. A grand staircase stretched upward into shadows, its banister carved with intricate patterns that looked like entwined figures, half human, half beast. The house was silent, yet Jonathan felt a pressure in the air, as though unseen eyes tracked his every movement. He stepped inside, his boots crunching on debris, and pulled the door shut behind him. The lock clicked on its own, sealing him in. For the first time since arriving, Jonathan felt a genuine tremor of unease. He whispered to himself, "It's just a house," but the words didn't feel true. First night, Jonathan's footsteps echoed through the hollow corridors as he explored the ground floor. The house smelled of dust, rot, and something faintly sour, as though time itself had spoiled inside these walls. He found the drawing room first, a vast chamber lined with portraits. Each painting depicted members of the Blackwood family, their expressions grim, their eyes sharp even through cracked varnish. As Jonathan's flashlight swept across them, he felt the strange impression that the faces were subtly turned toward him, their gaze following his movements. He shook his head and chuckled under his breath, convincing himself it was nothing more than his imagination paired with the oppressive stillness of the house. Night fell faster than expected. The windows, long unwashed, let in only a smear of moonlight, so Jonathan lit a few candles he had packed along with a camping lantern. The living room became his makeshift camp, with a blanket spread across an ancient sofa that sagged beneath his weight. The silence pressed in thicker now, broken only by the creaks and sighs of the old mansion settling into darkness. He tried to write, pen scratching across the first pages of his notebook, but words came slowly. Every few minutes, he stopped and glanced toward the staircase, unable to shake the feeling that something waited above. Around midnight, he heard the first sound. It was not the shuffle of rats or the usual groans of an old house, but something deliberate, measured footsteps moving across the upstairs landing. His heart stuttered in his chest. He froze, pen hovering over paper, straining to listen. The steps were slow, heavy, as though someone walked directly above him. Then, after a pause, came the sound of something dragging across the floor. Jonathan swallowed hard, the rational part of his mind whispering that it was nothing, while another part screamed that he was not alone. He forced himself to sit still, gripping the lantern so tightly that his knuckles whitened. Minutes stretched into an hour. The noises stopped, but the silence felt worse. It was no longer the stillness of an empty house. It was expectant, like the hush before a voice speaks in a darkened room. Jonathan's eyes drifted to the stairwell again. From where he sat, the landing above was hidden in shadow, yet he could not shake the impression of someone standing just out of sight, watching. Eventually, exhaustion overpowered his nerves, and he collapsed against the couch. His sleep was uneasy, broken by strange dreams. A woman's silhouette drifting through endless corridors, her hands pressed against unseen walls, her face always turned away that he awoke at dawn, drenched in cold sweat. The room smelled faintly of smoke, though the candles had burned out hours ago. His notebook, left open on the low table, was no longer blank. Across the page, written in a spidery hand not his own, were 3 words, "Leave this place." Jonathan's breath caught in his throat as he stared at the words. He had locked the doors, barred the windows. He had been alone. And yet, someone, or something, had been close enough to whisper across his paper in the night. The upper floor, the sun had barely cleared the horizon when Jonathan steeled himself to climb the stairs. He told himself it was ridiculous to be shaken by 3 words on a page. There had to be an explanation. Perhaps a draft had carried old soot or dust into patterns. Perhaps he had scribbled something in a half-sleep haze. But as he placed his hand on the banister, a chill spread through his fingers as though the wood itself recoiled at his touch. The carvings along the railing were clearer in the daylight, figures twisted in torment, faces caught mid-scream. For a moment, he thought he felt their shapes subtly shifting beneath his hand. The upper floor was colder than the ground level, the air carrying a dampness that clung to his throat. Hallways branched in every direction, lined with doors that hung crooked on their hinges. Wallpaper peeled in long strips, revealing plaster beneath like torn skin. Jonathan stepped carefully, the floorboards groaning under his weight. He paused before the first door, turned the knob, and pushed. The bedroom inside was untouched for decades. A 4-poster bed draped in moth-eaten fabric, a cracked mirror leaning against the wall, and an armoire half open with clothing that had long since rotted. Yet it wasn't the decay that caught him. It was the faint smell of perfume, fresh and sweet, hanging in the air as if someone had only just left. He pressed deeper into the hall. Another door revealed a child's nursery, littered with broken toys. Wooden blocks were scattered across the floor, spelling nothing in particular. Yet as Jonathan watched, one rolled across the floorboards on its own, stopping neatly at his boot. His breath caught, his heart hammering in his chest. He wanted to believe the house was simply shifting, nudging objects around. But when he stooped to pick it up, he noticed the letters carved into its surface. B. He set it back down, but another block rolled to join it, showing the letter E. Jonathan stumbled back, knocking against the doorframe. Unwilling to watch what word might be spelled next, at the far end of the hall stood a door heavier than the rest, sealed with an old lock. The key from his uncle's will seemed to fit perfectly, though Jonathan hesitated before turning it. Something about the door radiated unease, as if the house itself didn't want him to open it. But curiosity overcame fear. The lock gave way with a loud snap, and the door creaked open to reveal a study. Unlike the other rooms, this one looked preserved. Shelves of books still intact, papers strewn across a desk, and a large portrait hanging over the fireplace. The man in the painting bore a striking resemblance to Jonathan himself. The same sharp jawline, the same piercing eyes, though the painted version's expression was cold, unwelcoming. Almost hostile, Jonathan's legs felt weak as he approached the desk. His fingers brushed over brittle pages covered in dense handwriting. Journals filled with strange diagrams and passages that spoke of rituals, invocations, and the binding of restless spirits. One line repeated in different variations. The house feeds, the house remembers. Jonathan shivered as he closed the journal. When he turned back toward the fireplace, the painted man's eyes seemed sharper, alive, as though silently acknowledging his presence. For the first time, Jonathan wondered if coming to Hollow's End wasn't just an accident of inheritance, but a calling. Whispers of the past. Jonathan spent the morning in the study, combing through his uncle's journals. The ink had faded with age, but the words carried a precision that made his skin crawl. The earliest entries were mundane, records of estate management, notes about tenants, and remarks about the declining state of the house. But as the years progressed, the writings shifted. The uncle spoke of voices in the walls, of unseen figures moving in the corridors, of nights filled with screams no one else heard. One passage described the Blackwood family's gift, a bloodline cursed with the ability to hear the dead, drawn to Hollow's End as moths are drawn to flame. Jonathan's breath quickened as he read. If the words were true, then his presence here was not coincidence at all. He turned to later entries, where the handwriting grew increasingly frantic. His uncle mentioned a woman in white who wandered the upper hall, weeping softly for her child. He wrote of a nursery where toys moved of their own accord and of shadows that refused to disperse even in daylight. But the most chilling pages described the house itself. The house is not wood and stone, the journal read. It is hunger. It is memory. We are not its masters. We are its servants. Jonathan closed the book with trembling hands, feeling as though something unseen had leaned over his shoulder while he read. The longer he remained in the study, the heavier the air became. Dust drifted in slow spirals, though the windows were sealed. The faint crackle of the fireplace echoed, though no fire burned. And then, as Jonathan leaned against the desk, he heard it, a whisper, faint at first, like wind sliding through cracks in the wall. But the longer he listened, the clearer it became, a voice just beyond comprehension. He strained, leaning closer, and realized it was repeating his name. Jonathan. Jonathan. His pulse quickened. He spun around, but the room was empty, the door yawning open to the hallway beyond. Yet the whisper continued, weaving through the silence like smoke. Desperate for distraction, he lifted the portrait above the fireplace, wondering if something lay hidden behind it. The frame was heavy, its edges gouged with scratches. When he finally managed to pull it free, he discovered a narrow recess in the wall, containing a locked wooden box. The box was carved with symbols he didn't recognize, circles interwoven with jagged lines that looked almost like binding marks. A faint, acrid scent leaked from its cracks, like scorched earth. Jonathan tried the same iron key that had opened the door, but it did not fit. He slid the box back, unsettled, and returned the portrait to its place. Only now, the painted eyes seemed different, less hostile, more intent, as though urging him towards something inevitable. The whispers followed him as he left the study, echoing down the hall. Sometimes they were soft, other times sharp, cutting like glass. At one point, Jonathan stopped, convinced he heard not just his name but a warning. Do not open it. Do not wake what sleeps. He stumbled back toward the staircase, but his path was blocked by the nursery door. It had swung open wide, though he was certain he had left it half shut. Inside, the blocks had been rearranged into a single word: stay. The air grew thick and suffocating. Jonathan fled downstairs, his heart hammering. But even in the relative safety of the ground floor, he felt the house tightening around him, its whispers threading through his thoughts like hooks. The house closes in by late afternoon. Jonathan decided he had seen enough. His rational mind still clung to explanations, drafts, tricks of light, stress-induced hallucinations. But the journals, the whispers, and the moving objects gnawed at him. He stuffed his notebooks and lantern back into his satchel and headed for the front door. But when he turned the handle, it refused to budge. He pressed harder, then shoved with his shoulder, but the door would not open. The lock groaned under his efforts, yet held firm, as though welded shut by invisible hands. Panic rippled through him. He tried a window, prying at the warped wood, but the glass refused to break beneath the strike of a fireplace poker. The mansion had sealed itself, holding him inside like a fly in amber. The room seemed to shift as he moved, corridors stretching longer than he remembered, staircases slanting in directions they hadn't before. He opened a door expecting the kitchen and found instead the dusty dining hall, its long table set with rotting plates and glasses filled with stagnant water. A single chair at the head of the table stood upright, its cushion unstained, as though waiting for him. Jonathan staggered back, pulse hammering. The house was twisting its bones around him, folding him into its design. He ran to the foyer again, desperate, but the moment he reached the staircase, he froze. The portrait of his uncle, no, the man who looked like him, now hung above the entryway. Though it had belonged in the study upstairs, Jonathan's skin prickled with dread. He heard the faint shuffle of feet again, slow and deliberate, descending from the second floor. Lantern shaking in his grip, he lifted it toward the stairs, but nothing was there. Yet the sound continued, step by step by step, until it seemed to hover just above him. Then silence. His breath caught in his throat. He tried to speak, to demand that the presence reveal itself, but his voice cracked in the cavernous quiet. For the first time since arriving, he felt the certainty that the house was not simply haunted. It was aware, and it wanted him. He retreated into the parlor, lighting every candle he could find to push back the shadows. The flames quivered as though disturbed by a breath, stretching tall, then guttering low, as if unseen fingers were playing with them. Jonathan pressed his palms to his face and forced himself to breathe. He had come here seeking inspiration, but now he was trapped in a story he could not control. When he lowered his hands, he found the journal from upstairs sitting on the parlor table, though he had left it behind in the study. Its pages flapped open in a draft that wasn't there, settling on a line written in ink that looked fresh. Do not resist. You are home. Exhaustion and terror warred inside him. He stumbled back toward the sofa, clutching his lantern, when a sound tore through the house. The sudden slam of every door upstairs, one after another, like a thunderous drum roll. The echoes rattled the floor beneath him. Then came the voice, no longer a whisper, but a chorus, layered and distorted, filling every corner of Hollow's End. It spoke only one word, stretched long, vibrating in his bones. Stay. Jonathan clamped his hands over his ears, but it did nothing to drown it out. He sank to his knees, realizing the truth. Leaving was no longer an option. The house had chosen him. The woman in white. Jonathan did not sleep that night. He sat in the parlor with the journal open before him, lantern burning low, eyes fixed on the shifting shadows. Every sound became amplified. The groan of beams, the faint scratching in the walls, the slow drip of water somewhere unseen. At times he thought he heard breathing close behind him, but when he turned, nothing was there. Near dawn, exhaustion pulled him into a dazed half-slumber. That was when he heard it, soft weeping, distant but unmistakable, echoing through the halls. His uncle's words came back to him, a woman in white, wandering, searching for her child. Jonathan stood, lantern in hand, and followed the sound. The crying grew louder as he climbed the stairs, wavering between heartbreak and hysteria. The nursery door was ajar again, and from within spilled the faint glow of moonlight. Jonathan pushed it open, his breath fogging in the sudden cold. There she was. A figure stood at the far end of the room, cloaked in a white gown that shimmered faintly in the dark. Her back was turned, her long black hair trailing down like a curtain. She bent over a cradle, rocking it gently with one pale hand. But the cradle was empty. Jonathan's voice caught in his throat. He dared not move closer, terrified of shattering the fragile illusion before him. Her weeping stopped. The silence that followed was thick, suffocating. Slowly, impossibly slowly, the woman turned her head toward him. Her face was pale, almost translucent, her eyes hollowed pits of sorrow. She did not speak, but Jonathan felt her anguish pouring into him like icy water. His lantern flickered violently. The cradle creaked once more, and then she was gone. The room empty except for broken toys and dust. But the air still carried the faint smell of lilies, fresh and sharp. Jonathan staggered back, pressing his hand to the doorframe, trying to steady his breathing. He had seen her. She was not a whisper or a trick. She was real. The rest of the house seemed to stir in response. Doors moaned open one by one down the hall, as if unseen inhabitants were emerging from their rooms. Jonathan heard footsteps pacing in different directions, soft, dragging, hurried, slow. Voices overlapped, low murmurs tangled together into something inhuman. He clutched his satchel against his chest, retreating toward the stairs, but the sound followed him, spilling over the landing, filling every corner of Hollow's End. He realized he was no longer intruding into the house. The house was showing itself to him, peeling away its mask. Back downstairs, Jonathan dropped into the parlor chair and buried his face in his hands. His uncle's words thundered in his mind. The house feeds, the house remembers. He began to suspect the spirits weren't merely haunting Hollow's End. They were bound to it, prisoners of something larger and older than themselves. And now that he had entered, the house had begun to weave him into its collection. For the first time, Jonathan felt not just fear, but pity. He was not alone in being trapped here. The dead were too. The binding Jonathan knew running in circles would not save him. The house was alive, shifting around him like a labyrinth. If he wanted to survive, he needed to understand what kept the dead tethered here. Back in the study, he gathered the journals, stacking them in frantic piles, searching for patterns. Hours passed as he traced his uncle's notes, symbols sketched in margins, references to rituals older than the Blackwoods themselves. One phrase surfaced again and again, the binding. It was described as a pact sealed in blood, an agreement that tied the family's souls to Hollow's End. Death was not an escape. It was a migration, one body dissolving into the house itself. As he translated the notes, a clearer picture formed. The binding had been performed generations ago by the first Blackwood patriarch, a man who feared death above all else. He bargained with forces nameless and ancient, offering not only his soul but the souls of his bloodline in exchange for eternal dominion within the house. The price was steep. The family's spirits could never leave. Their lives, their deaths, their memories were swallowed into Hollow's End, layer upon layer until the house became less a structure and more a living archive of suffering. Jonathan realized with a cold clarity, this was his inheritance. Not property, but a prison. The realization emboldened him. If the house held the dead, then perhaps he could speak to them, learn what bound them so tightly. Armed with a lantern and journal, he returned to the nursery where he had seen the woman in white. He set the lantern on the floor and whispered into the silence. "I know you're here. I know you can hear me." At first, only stillness answered. Then the air thickened and the temperature dropped sharply. The rocking cradle began to sway on its own. Jonathan swallowed his fear and asked, "What keeps you here? Why won't you leave?" The answer came not in words, but in images that slammed into his mind like visions. He saw the patriarch, cloaked in shadows, slashing his palm and pressing blood into the floorboards of the very study he had discovered. He saw generations of Blackwoods standing in ritual circles, their throats slit, their spirits drawn screaming into the house like smoke. And finally, he saw the woman in white clutching a stillborn child, her grief binding her so tightly that even death could not pry her away. Jonathan fell to his knees, gasping, his head pounding with their memories. The house was a vessel, and the dead were its marrow. As he staggered back, panting, he noticed something scrawled on the nursery wall, faint and chalky as if written by a child's hand. "Break the circle." His lantern flickered violently, and behind him, the woman in white appeared again, closer this time, her hollow eyes fixed on him. But instead of reaching for him, she lifted her pale hand and pointed toward the study. Jonathan followed her gaze, heart racing. Whatever truth she wanted him to uncover was hidden there, buried in the Blackwoods' ritual chamber. The ritual chamber. Jonathan returned to the study with the words, "Break the circle," ringing in his mind. He searched the floorboards, pushing aside the desk and bookshelves until he found it, a section of wood darker than the rest, scarred with faint carvings. Kneeling, he traced the symbols with his fingers. They matched the ones carved into the hidden box behind the portrait. With a deep breath, he pressed down, and the boards gave way, revealing a narrow stairwell spiraling into darkness. A bitter draft rose from below, carrying the stench of earth and decay. Lantern trembling in his hand, Jonathan descended. The staircase seemed to stretch endlessly, stone walls slick with moisture. His footsteps echoed as though the house itself were hollow, its foundation a cavern of secrets. At the bottom, he emerged into a vast underground chamber. The ceiling arched high, supported by blackened beams, and the floor was marked with a massive circular design burned into the stone. Candlesticks, long dead, stood in iron holders around the perimeter. Bones littered the edges of the circle. Human bones, their shapes unmistakable even in the lantern's weak glow. Jonathan's stomach twisted as he realized he was standing in the Blackwood family's altar. At the center of the circle stood the wooden box. Unlike before, it was not closed. Its lid hung slightly ajar, and from within spilled a faint red glow, pulsing like a heartbeat. Jonathan froze, pulse racing in sync with the box's glow. The whispering voices he had heard upstairs were deafening here, layered into a chorus of despair. They rose and fell in waves, sometimes begging, sometimes warning, sometimes laughing with manic glee. Jonathan clutched the journal, flipping to the entries about the binding. The words were clearer now. The circle feeds. The box contains. To break the house, break the sealed as he drew closer. The whispers sharpened into words. Open it. The voices overlapped, some pleading, some commanding. The box seemed to breathe, inhaling and exhaling faint plumes of red mist. Jonathan's hand hovered above it, drawn by a force both magnetic and revolting. He felt the truth in his bones. The box was no mere container. It was a prison. Something had been locked away here long ago, something not of the Blackwood family, but the very power they had bargained with. His uncle's frantic warnings echoed in his mind. Do not wake what sleeps. The air grew heavy, pressing against his chest. A figure materialized at the edge of the circle, the woman in white. Her hollow eyes fixed on him as she raised her arm, pointing not at the box, but at the lines of the circle burned into the floor. Break the circle, she had told him. Jonathan's lantern sputtered, nearly going out, and in the brief flicker of darkness he saw more figures gathering at the chamber's edge. Dozens of them, pale and distorted, the whole Blackwood bloodline, watching in silence. They did not cross the circle. They could not. All of them were trapped within its grip. Jonathan gripped the lantern tighter, realizing what he had to do, but also what it might unleash. The awakening Jonathan's hands shook as he stared at the glowing circle. The woman in white stood motionless, her pale face carved with grief, her fingers still pointing toward the blackened floor. The ghosts crowding the edges of the chamber whispered in unison, their voices a tide that rose and fell with the red glow of the box. Break it, some begged. Don't, others hissed. He realized then that even the spirits were divided. Some longed for release, others feared what freedom would awaken. Sweat poured down his neck as he tightened his grip on the lantern. He raised the fireplace poker he had carried from upstairs, its iron end jagged and rusted. He took a breath and brought it crashing down on the circle's edge. The sound reverberated like thunder, stone cracking under the blow. The floor groaned. Dust fell from the beams above. A shriek tore through the chamber, not human, not ghostly, but something deeper, an ancient howl of rage. Jonathan staggered back as the glowing circle began to splinter, red light bursting through the cracks like molten fire. The ghosts wailed, some reaching toward him, others covering their faces. The box at the center shuddered violently, its lid slamming shut with a force that rattled the chamber. But the glow did not fade. Instead, it intensified, bleeding through the seams until the box seemed on the verge of bursting apart. The woman in white stepped closer, her form flickering, unstable. Her voice came at last, soft but commanding. Free us. Jonathan brought the poker down again, smashing the circle's lines. Each strike widened the cracks. Each strike unleashed another wave of screams. The chamber shook, dust raining from the ceiling, stones splitting as the binding came undone. Then, silence. The red glow snapped out, plunging the chamber into darkness. For a heartbeat, Jonathan thought it was over. The ghosts were gone, their whispers erased. Even the woman in white had vanished, leaving only the echo of her weeping. He collapsed onto the floor, breath ragged, relief washing through him. But then came the sound, the faintest rattle from within the box. Slow, patient, something shifting inside. The circle was broken, the binding undone, and with it, the prison that had held the true occupant of Hollows End. A deep voice, older than language, seeped into the chamber, vibrating through Jonathan's bones. At last, the box cracked open wider, red light spilling out like a flood, illuminating the walls in veins of fire. A shadow rose from within, enormous and shapeless, its form flickering between beast and smoke. The Blackwoods had not merely bound their family, they had bound this. And now Jonathan had set it free. The last master the shadow poured upward from the box, filling the chamber with a form that defied reason. It was not a creature but an absence, a wound in reality, swallowing light wherever it moved. Tendrils of smoke lashed across the floor, striking the walls and leaving scorched scars. The voices of the Blackwood ghosts rose again, but now they screamed not at Jonathan, but at the thing rising before him. They had not been the house's rulers. They had been its sacrifices. Jonathan staggered to his feet, lantern trembling in his grip, and for the first time understood the truth. The Blackwoods had not built Hollow's End. They had only fed it. The entity's voice rolled through the chamber like a storm. Blood called me. Blood bound me. And blood has freed me. Its shadowy tendrils reached for Jonathan, caressing his chest, his throat, as if tasting him. He could feel its hunger, endless and patient, stretching back centuries. In that moment, the weight of his inheritance pressed down on him. The Blackwoods had sealed this thing into the foundations of Hollow's End, chaining their souls to it to keep it contained. Now, with the binding broken, it demanded a new keeper. Jonathan's blood, Blackwood blood, was the final key. The woman in white appeared once more, her figure shimmering faintly in the storm of shadows. She did not speak this time, but her eyes begged him to choose, surrender or resist. At her feet, the broken chalk words burned faintly, break the circle. Jonathan realized breaking the circle had not destroyed the entity. It had only released the spirits. The prison was open, but the key remained in his blood. He had one choice left, to let the entity take him and live forever as Hollow's End's vessel, or to destroy the house entirely, even if it meant destroying himself with it. He gripped the lantern tightly, heart hammering. His uncle's journal lay at his side, its last line etched in his memory. The house feeds, the house remembers. If the house remembered, then perhaps it could also forget. Jonathan hurled the lantern into the box at the circle's center. The oil ignited instantly, red mist bursting into flames that licked up the shadow's form. The chamber shook violently, the walls splitting, beams collapsing. The entity shrieked, a sound that shattered stone, as its tendrils recoiled into the fire. Jonathan shielded his face, but did not run. He knew there would be no escape. If the house was to fall, it had to fall with him. The last thing he saw was the woman in white, her face soft with gratitude, cradling the faint outline of her child in her arms. Around her, the other spirits dissolved into pale light, finally free. The flames consumed everything: stone, shadow, bone, and wood. Hollow's End groaned like a dying beast as the hill itself seemed to sink beneath the weight of its ruin. When the smoke cleared at dawn, nothing remained of the mansion but scorched earth and fragments of blackened stone. The townsfolk whispered for years afterward of the night the hill burned, of the man who vanished with the house. But in time, even those whispers faded, until Hollow's End was only a memory, forgotten at last.